Hey everyone, this is Bijoy, and we are at Art 84, which is an incredible art space on 84 Waller as part of the East Austin Studio Tour. And Harrison is one of the artists, photographers, and architects who's actually showing a number of pieces. And I just found his sequence of pieces so fascinating. I grew up in Asia, in Hong Kong, and visited Japan myself. And there's so many things that are being touched on here. So I wanted to get your thoughts on like what inspired you and explore some of the ideas that are happening in this sequence of pictures.
Yeah, of course, Bijoy. We talked at length for a while the other day, and I was really excited to kind of get your take on it. Just go through it again, talk about it, get it on the record. So as you mentioned, this collection of works is from or inspired by a trip I took to Japan. This previous summer, and taken as its sort of foundation a set of photographs that I came back with. So these are all derived initially from photographs and turned into the pieces that are here on the wall. Really what I was trying to sort of get across with this experiment, or this series, was to capture sort of the essence of what I thought was presence in Japan, in the nature and in the architecture and everything in between. As you mentioned, I'm an architecture designer by trade, and I have a really thorough interest in the intersection of like the natural world and the built world. And I was trying to sort of convey that relationship as I saw it and do it service in sort of describing how that relationship is like played out in the natural world.
When was this trip taken that you did this trip that you had?
This past May.
This May, okay.
May of 2019.
Okay.
Yeah. So the pieces are all sort of named based on their locations, and taken from various parts along the trip, and then stitched together into something of like a narrative that I was trying to state about sort of the state of Japanese naturalism and how the Japanese understand nature and architecture and light and dark and everything in between. So architecture in the traditional Japanese sense always has sort of an aspect of embracing nature, right? So the Japanese built to last, to like preserve their buildings and, make them like habitable. But also there was a deep recognition of nature always being sort of the the top authority. So everything that was built would always return to nature, and they always sort of built things understanding that. The best structures in Japan are sort of characterized by their relationship with nature, and there's nothing like a weathered, worn, slightly faded, like Japanese home. And I think that is something that's conveyed there in the architecture and in the nature, and hopefully in the series.
Right. So that sense of being lived in and being integrated into the world is essential. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's I'll sort of go and like start use this as an opportunity to get into it. So this particular one, which is sort of the one that inspired the whole series, is what kicked off this idea of integration of architecture and nature. It depicts a Japanese torii gate on the island, or an island off the coast of the city of Kamikura. And in the background, there's the entryway to a temple or a shrine depicted. And what this particular piece is trying to convey is this idea in Japanese mythology of the shrine being a collection of things. Like it's not just the building itself, it's the entryway, the threshold, and then the actual like presence of the shrine is more of a marker for something sacred rather than the sacred thing itself. So the building isn't sacred, it enshrines the mountain, or a cave, or a creek, or something deep,
which is the sacred thing
in the wilderness, because the wilderness is the part that is like considered sacred.
Right.
The mountains are like thought of as being like alive almost, and like this is how they would tap into that like sacred energy. So I took that idea, something that I learned while I was in Japan, through my own studies, and tried to sort of render it in representation in this series. And it came through in this particular work early on, and I was sort of taken aback at like how it turned out, and that inspired me to take the next step as sort of like a signal or a series of like signifiers in a process of trying to find this like spiritualism in nature.
I mean, here it's interesting because you took a photograph initially.
Yes.
Okay, and then you've done a process to create these pieces, right? Which hopefully we'll get some insight into later. But what is interesting here is, there's just, it's so simple. There's three elements, right? There's the shrine, there's the gate, there's the shrine, or at least the hint of the shrine, and
The
then
enshrinement, yeah.
and then there's the actual. Now, are those tree? There are those leaves on a tree.
That's
or clouds?
sort of a hillside.
Okay, it's a hillside. Okay.
So this shrine is in perspective. It's quite far in the distance,
Right.
and then the hillside behind it is what is like sort of exploding out from behind the enshrinement.
Right.
And that's kind of the purpose of the representation.
Yeah.
Is like there's something here in the gate, but then also there's something like beyond everything that's built that
Right.
is somehow more profound than any of the signifiers by themselves.
Yeah. This completeness. In a sense, without the gate and the shrine, nature. We wouldn't actually be able to take in nature. It's like
They wouldn't relate to it as well.
yeah. So this is a way for the human being to enter into that space, which is fascinating. Who was it? Linda that was here the artist Linda was here the other day when we were talking, and she was talking about how the size of these pieces that you've got them. This is what 11 by 14.
Yes.
And she was saying she wanted to see them huge. Which is interesting because you've got like three sizes here, but even 16 by 20 is not exactly what she was thinking about. She's like, because imagine this piece just large and you're.
Sometimes people need to be limited in their options.
Right,
Sometimes
right.
something is best taken in small quantities.
Well, especially because there's kind of relationship here, right, between these, right? So, okay, so was there more you wanted to say about that here at this point, or?
We can keep going. Yeah.
Okay.
No, I think it's probably a good transition into this next one, which is sort of the focus itself is the natural object and sort of the presence of that object. So it's more of like moving from like a perspective towards like a still life of an object.
Right.
So in this particular photograph, the image is of a tree stump that has been, or a tree rather, that has been dead for some time.
Right.
And has since been partially reclaimed by the environment and like repurposed in its like usefulness.
Right. Its
Or
natural
it's-
process is is already happening, and now it's present, but it's dead, I guess.
Yeah, it's still quite striking though. Old dead trees have something of an air of like austerity to them. Like even when they're past, it's like you feel like you're in the presence of like old giants or something, or titans of like a past like era.
Right.
It's like a sense you get in a lot of the old like forests in Japan.
But it's also interesting because you were saying how the architecture wants to be an object that endures, or is there even when humans perhaps have long since gone, that those objects, the man-made ones, are going to still be there as a testament. And here, this tree is its own testament to its own self, right? The natural journey. It feels very architectural, like just from this is a top-down view, top-in view of the piece, right? It just feels very architectural.
It was constructed intentionally for sure. And there's something about the axiomatic like focus that is like translating the significance of the piece.
Well, it's also like a city, and it's also that's the zero stroke of when you do calligraphy, you do a circle. It's got a lot of imagery in it just from that one piece.
So yeah, why don't we transition on like to somewhat of the exact opposite, rather.
Right.
So in the previous picture, we were dealing more with like a still life of a singular object in focus, but I think there is more to representation than the object that is the subject of the piece, and that's kind of what I was trying to convey with this next in the stage or in the series, is sort of a sense of wholeness wrapped together by an object. So the object isn't only the object itself, but it relates to its surroundings, which is sort of inferred to by the border perimeter of this particular piece. It's sort of...
You mean this border, or you mean
the border of the framed portion.
Okay.
So it implies that there is something outside of what is framed, and that this is merely one part of a whole, but also seems to be something of a bridge between like the earth and like the sky,
right?
Canopy.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because there's sort of these dualities that are operating, and it's funny because one of my favorite stories though I have a different relationship to it over time, is the giving tree.
Mm-hmm.
And it, how the tree starts off like this and gives its life.
Ends its life.
And it's over here, and it's just continually giving of itself to the boy.
And here I'm telling you that the relationship is backwards. Or something.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, cool. So we've got the tree that's now alive and in nature. And then here we've got this last in the series, well, the fourth in this series.
The fourth in this particular series,
Yeah.
So I mentioned earlier sort of the presence that like an ancient like creature, or in this case, a tree, which is a living thing, has in the environment, and how like much weight it sort of adds to like an area. And this particular piece was rendered from the mountain village of Koyasan, which is a sort of a sacred shrine and it's a temple complex for Zen Buddhism in Japan. Sort of the like center for that particular like sect of Buddhism. And this is sort of a scene from the Buddhist graveyard, or the Buddhist cemetery, which is over 2,000 years old, I believe. And I want to say that the trees that are present are comparable in age. I'm not sure if they can quite make it 2,000 years, but
right.
Trees have been known to last many hundreds of years, if nothing else.
Yes, absolutely. And so here we're looking at this major tree that's coming through here, and then we've got the graves that are here, and then are these other trees that are
in the background?
Yes. Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
So I was sort of trying to speak of something of the relationship to like the living and the dead and the natural environment, and how all of these things are like sort of in sequence and in cycle and always and constantly in flux.
Right.
So this sort of draws the series to a close and brings it back like from like life and like sacredness to sacredness and death, or like the signifiers of like past lives, and the significance they had.
Well, even architecturally, it's back to the architecture thing. It's just these graves feel like they belong there, in that space, right? So.
Yeah, like it doesn't seem out of place. It seems like the architecture is as much a part of the nature as like the nature is.
Right.
So.
Right. It's not trying to step outside of it. It's trying to be part of it.
Exactly.
And yet not lose its distinctive human. I mean, it's got to be very human. We make geometric shapes, and right? I mean,
no, it's easy to cut a stone in like a series of flat faces. And
right.
That's just how we make things.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, so that's interesting. So you've got. So I think so. We were kind of coming to a set of dualities. I mean, I think that's one of the things that's interesting in the Eastern notion of, the balance of yin and yang, right? Like the light and the dark, and the balance of all kinds of different opposites. So one set of opposites you've illustrated is the man-made, and the nature. That's one thing that we've been kind of talking about. Then there's the black and white, because you really just you reduce these down to. I'm guessing there were colored pictures before.
Eventually,
then you've reduced them down to black and white. And so what's going on there with just the lines versus the white space, the negative space, and then the gray, I guess.
Yeah, so I think it's each of the three sort of has a role to play in the portraying of an object and the description of a relationship. So in drawing and in architecture, we're taught that sort of the delineating line is what like defines the object or space, but what really elaborates on what is present is the shadows, the ambiguity, the blending of light and dark. That's how we read space, that's how we relate to our environment, and the relationship of black and white and everything in between is certainly not a mistake in this series. And it's the grays that really define what is like profound about like the subject matter. It's the in-between.
Right.
Or the collapsing of light into dark and then back again. The idea of yin and yang.
Right. I mean, I've always thought of that line, that line, the border in between the two, as that's where the action is, But when I have a interesting, I often thought of the yin yang, as a static symbol. But I had this story in my head about Lao Tzu, who was, who came up with the old master, the old teacher, and people would say, Lao Tzu, tell us about the universe, and he'd say, well, and he's sitting under a tree, and this is funny. This is a story that's just coming to mind that I've had for years. And Lao Tzu takes his cane, and he starts drawing. He says, this is how the universe goes, and he starts drawing the yin yang. And now all of a sudden, now this thing is giving us time, right? So imagine you're exploring the yin yang, you're going from one side, and maybe the positive aspect of one aspect of something, over-expressing it, then it becomes the negative aspect of that. Then you reject that aspect, you go to the other side, discover the positive aspect of the opposite, the negative aspect of that opposite, and then you're kind of full circle.
And you're back where you started.
Or back where you started, but now you have this, with this full perspective, now you can enter into the border area that you were talking about and bring these two opposites together, right?
Yeah.
So you travel the interior, and then guess what? You're down again, and you repeat, and now you've got an infinity.
Yeah, there's like the mistake that many Westerners make when they see the yin yang symbol is that they think they instantly understand it by just like looking at it. By its nature of being black and white, it's like, oh, it's light and dark.
Right.
But it's really the relationship of light to dark, in that even in the darkest of darks, there is like light, and even in the brightest of blinding lights, there is dark to keep it anchored. All things are cyclical in nature and like relate to each other.
Yeah, it's like a circular notion of time. Versus we have a linear notion of time in the West, but like it's like okay, this circular notion of repeating things that are coming back and forth. I mean, I guess that's really interesting because maybe that's the ultimate cycle that we're talking about, which is life and death, which is very much embodied here. You can reorder this in an interesting sequence where life and death could be the theme, and then you're going in a different sequence potentially, right?
Yeah, or maybe like it's this one first, and then this one, and then this one, and then this one, or something, and. But that's like the ambiguity of like all of these things interrelating with each other gets back to sort of the intention of the piece. Like it's not about being linear; it's about everything relating back to everything else.
Yeah. Well, I mean that's what I think is interesting because you're constrained by Larry's house, and, and this is the space you've got. So you've got this kind of thing, but
we're surrounded by orthogonal walls. That
that are not right. But I'm imagining if somebody gets these pieces and they have them in their home, they might arrange them in all kinds of really interesting ways. Maybe in a circular pattern, and maybe they move them around. Maybe they're right. They kind of like, I'm feeling this sequence now, and then they can go back and say, I want to ponder this, and they can move the sequence around.
Or they wrap them around a really big lampshade or something.
Exactly. Yeah, that's fascinating. Well,
I mean, whatever gets people to buy my prints, man.
You're just a capitalist at the end of the day. Well, I mean, that's the 20th century artist. You know, he's a capitalist. He's got to sell his art. You know? Yeah, I mean, there's no state, there's no king, there's no church that's going to fund your efforts.
The people are my patrons, and I must appease them, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, that's what I think is so interesting about. Part of what I think of as art, is especially in the 20th century and 21st century now, is these are meaning objects. That you're basically taking your journey, taking your eye, your observation, your skills, you're going and creating this set of objects that has great meaning to you. And then now you release them into the world, and now I'm so curious what people will see from this sequence. I guess there's a fifth piece.
There is a fifth
piece. That perhaps unites all of this or kind of brings it all together in an interesting way.
You may have had a glimpse of it if you were following the roll super quickly.
Yes, that's right. The little pieces. So maybe we should cover that when we maybe sit down.
Yeah, for sure. We'll be back to you guys in a second.
All right. So what was interesting when we were talking the last time was we were going through the four pieces and we were having this discussion. I feel like there's a missing piece. Well, I guess we're on a show, Silverstein.
An obvious blank space on the wall. Yeah.
Well, there was obvious blanks, but it was more like there was something that hadn't quite completed, and I guess we're on a Shel Silverstein path because we talked about the Giving Tree. And he has a wonderful story called The Missing Piece, which is a circle that's got a wedge missing that's trying to find its way, in the world. And you said, oh, by the way, I do have a fifth piece that I'm still getting framed and getting printed.
Yeah.
And this is the one. I guess what strikes me first is that all the others are landscape, and this one's in portrait.
This one is in portrait.
So what's going on with that?
So
other than obviously
it's intended to be sort of framed differently to kind of draw attention to itself, and it is, as sort of you say, and as we talked about previously a little bit, that this is sort of the piece that, in my eyes, kind of ties the spirit of the collection together. It, in a very simple, like short statement, kind of states like, what has been will be again, and unto itself. So the iconography is of a stump with a sapling growing out of the stump. The dead gives rise to like rebirth. And that's really what this series is all about, is that cycle of like life and death and rebirth and light and dark, and how it sort of is represented by like the man-made and the natural and all of these dualities that relate to each other.
This continuing, never-ending cycle.
Exactly. Yeah. That we all live in.
Right, exactly. Well, I mean, what's interesting, right, is in the Western mind, there's sort of like this birth, death, and heaven. That's the
a linear progression.
Again, back to a linear progression, and that's the terminal point. Is you get to heaven, and in the Eastern mind, which is even in India, the idea of rebirth.
Yeah, reincarnation.
All of that, and then of course here, it's just we're part of a cycle, whether we're aware of it or not, right? Whether I'm the being that knows that I was a previous being in some other form.
Right, yeah.
But what that gives us, I mean, I guess, what is it for you that attracts you to, I mean, you never grew up in Japan, you didn't grow up in Asia. I mean, I spent all my, growing up times in that part of the world. I came to the States later. But you have this allure, there's something about it that as a philosophy, I mean, and an approach, not just to architecture, but maybe broader to life. So what is that for you? Like, when did that start for you, and what is that about?
I think what you're speaking of, too, a little bit is this sort of essence of ambiguity. This idea of a lack of certainty and moreover like a blurring of like the lines. And I do think that's something of a philosophy for me. I don't think I necessarily realized it as much as when I made this trip, and, just going through life and having experiences.
You grew up in Austin.
I did. Yes.
You're a unicorn.
Yeah.
Born and raised in Austin.
Lots of people move in Austin these days, but there are many of us original ones.
Right.
But yeah, it's been something of just a theme for me, something that's always interested me. Like I'm fascinated by how something can simultaneously be like correct and entirely wrong, or like one way until you like look at it from a certain light. And it is sort of humbling to recognize that we don't know certainly about anything. Like there is always ambiguity. Everything is subjective. Everything is suspect to ultimately our senses. What we perceive at the end of the day. And that has been a mainstay in my work, I think. It's been a sort of a driving like influence through all of the things that I've done, whether it be architecture or art. And I think that I plan on continuing down that path. So I definitely assure you will see that theme
in the
future. Yeah.
But I mean, this for you, it's fundamental. It's a way of being and seeing the world. That is not necessarily how the world you grew up in, right? I mean, it's or at least the prevailing notion of it.
We talked about sort of the differences between the West and the East before, and like sort of foundationally, there is a concept of one way or the other. Like the theocracy of the Bible like teaches us that there is good and there is evil. And if you do good, then you'll end up on the good side, and if you do bad, you'll end up on the bad side.
Binary result, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And the Eastern philosophy has really been sort of relatable to me because it sort of speaks to something that I've always kind of felt, just about the way things are. Just because I've seen so many things disproven or like, flipped and turned and like spun with clever wording or something, or just everything is ambiguous. And what really makes something impactful is how you understand it holistically, rather than split like dictatorially. Go, it is this way.
I mean, it seems like in that context, the Western thing is a fairy tale. It's a simple little fairy tale versus the Eastern concept is much more, here's what life is, maybe,
But a fairy tale is an interesting thing regardless, and the East sounds like a wonderful fairy tale of its own. I think they're both interesting. I think they both have their strengths, but I know, like, I understand why I like the Eastern philosophy.
Right.
Whereas before, I didn't really know much about it, and I think the subsequent trips to Japan have really kind of, like, opened up my, like, viewpoint on that, like, matter.
Yeah. Joseph Campbell, who did work on mythology, when he first went to Japan, he was actually very disappointed because he felt that the philosophy and the reality were what he read from texts and what he meant, stories was not what he saw. But over time, he started to understand what that was really all about. But I guess maybe the ultimate duality that we're dealing with is the East and the West in this particular conversation. I mean,
it gets simplified to in everyday discussion. Yeah.
Yeah,
sure.
but I mean, in this, like in all of this, the yin and yang of this conversation is the Eastern perspective and the Western perspective, and even that's held in because what this seems to be saying is more perspectives equal more insight.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
And so an Eastern perspective is insightful, and a Western perspective is insightful, which itself is a duality that we can.
Everything is a duality, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Do you think you'll ever move to like stay longer, or I mean, obviously you probably will visit again, but do you think you'll ever live in Asia, or?
I will certainly visit as frequently as I can. I am not sure if I can speak to whether or not I would ever move there.
Right.
It's too far in the distance to look at or speculate on.
But at least we know that we can expect more pieces out of you that are reflecting and thinking about all of that.
Yeah. I would very much like to do more like this. Look to explore new questions that I haven't necessarily asked myself yet. So.
I mean, I just appreciate, how in something so simple, that you captured here, that we've been able to have such an interesting and rich conversation, and I'm excited for what people experience when they hear this, and then come hopefully and see the pieces in person and inspect them and contemplate their own journeys.
Thank you very much for talking with me today. It's been really satisfying to get all this out there and spoken, and because again, like most things, you can't quite grasp until you've had a conversation with someone about them.
Yeah. Well, and the thing about there's this interesting thing, which is that artists want art to speak for itself, but it really doesn't in the sense that it can, but in the world we're in, the ambiguous world that we're in, which is subjective and personal, we need to know, we need to understand what the artist was thinking about, what they were contemplating. And then from there, that becomes a jumping off point that we can actually engage with it.
You can still draw your own conclusions, but
Absolutely.
you have a starting point.
Yeah, it gets the plane taking off, So I hope people come and see these in person at 84 Waller, at Art 84.
Mm-hmm.
And how else can they find your... You put your pieces up on your website or
I do,
Instagram?
yes.
Or?
Yeah, I have an Instagram at harrison.merrick, and then the website would be harrisonmerrick.com.
Thanks so much. Happy East 2019, and thank you for contributing to such a special part of it.
Yeah, no, thank you for talking with me today.
Absolutely.